you very, very much, Satyajyoti. This is interesting, that one, because I often get introduced these days with being ordained in 1976, when I was 19 and all that sort of thing. And I'm really getting a bit more uncomfortable with that now, because, you start thinking, well, you've been practicing Buddhism and meditation all that time. Shouldn't there be a bit more showy? Anyway, thank you. It was a lovely introduction. And yes, as Satyajyoti said, I'm the president of the Sheffield Buddhist Centre, and I come here twice a year for a 1-week block. And it really is these 2 weeks each year are among the highlights of my year. I really enjoy coming here to the centre. And one of the things that's very noticeable about coming to the centre is that there's always new faces. There are people here, I always give a talk at Sangha night, and there are people here I haven't seen at Sangha night before, and I don't think it's just that I've missed you all the other times that I've been here, and it's lovely to see that, as well as lots of old friends as well. So it's a great pleasure for me to come here. So I'm giving a talk in this series on, is it shocking Buddhist ideas or radical reality? I think there have been various discussions about the title of the talk, and the title of my talk is The Individual is a Myth, which isn't my title, just so that you know that. I'm not sure I would have called it that, but anyway, that's the title that I've been given. I wanted to begin this talk by saying that if we go back to the Buddha, or indeed if we think of any of the great Buddhist teachers down the ages, none of them have sought to shock. The Buddha didn't, after his enlightenment, think, how can I shock the people of northern India, the people of Magadha and the people of the Vajin Republic and the different nations that made up India at that time. He didn't think like that, self-consciously. I'm going to go out and shock you. He didn't even think in terms of having, I think, radical ideas. What he wanted to communicate was enlightenment, bodhi, complete and perfect enlightenment. The way things really are, as it is, and how each and every individual, man and woman, could follow a path to that enlightenment, could unfold and transform themselves into an enlightened being like himself, completely liberated from their conditioning of various kinds, completely liberated from the sort of narrow, constricted experience that they had into something completely open-ended, filled with quality and creativity, a life of, in the end, of love, compassion, freedom, energy, free-flowing energy, a life lived in service, happy, natural service for the benefit of others, so that all may live this enlightening life, this life of, this maturing life to Buddhahood. That's what the Buddha did. It wasn't anything to do with shocking people. However, the implications of that vision and that insight and that teaching was indeed radical reality, was indeed very, very shocking. And this is illustrated, in fact, very soon after the Buddha's enlightenment. A very interesting story. You mustn't think of enlightenment as one sort of mind-blowing experience. It's not really like that. It's more like an unfoldment of different experiences, if you can call something which takes place outside of the subject-object framework and experience, which you can't. But there are a number of stories around the time of the Buddha's enlightenment. And one of them, after the enlightenment, he's sitting under one of the trees in the forest in his rag robes, very lean, very handsome, very, I don't know, probably fascinating, fresh from Buddhahood, if you like, fresh from awakening. And a man came to see him, a Brahmin, someone from the Brahmin caste, what Brahmins would think is the highest caste in that highly stratified system that is still prevalent in India. And he asks the newly enlightened Buddha, because the newly enlightened Buddha is some holy man, so you would go and ask a holy man this question: what is a Brahmin? What is a Brahmin? And apparently this Brahmin was known as Ahunkara, different interpretations of the word Ahunkara, but one of them is that he was very haughty, because he went around going, oh, oh. That's one of the interpretations. Brahmins, I'm told, are famous for their haughtiness and conceit. And so he asks the Buddha, who is a Brahmin? And the Buddha immediately answers, a Brahmin is not somebody who is conceited. A Brahmin is not someone born of the Brahmin caste. And he gives various moral qualities of what the true Brahmin is. In other words, he's trying to redefine, if you like, who the aristocrat is, who the top person is. And he tries to redefine it in terms of individual moral qualities open to anybody. It's a very important moment in Buddhist history, a very important moment in the Pali Canon in the Buddhist scriptures, because it's showing very, very clearly that the Buddha's enlightenment, the Buddha's Dhamma, the Buddha's teaching, is having direct, not just spiritual impact, but social impact, religio-social impact, even, you might say, political impact. The Buddha's enlightenment, because the Buddha's enlightenment is about human beings, individual human beings, completely seeing through the bogus stratification of people in terms of caste or class or anything like that. He cuts through. He cuts through in that very short speech to the Brahmin. He cuts through and says, no, you are not a Brahmin. That's in effect what he's saying. Just because you're born in that community, it doesn't mean you have the moral and spiritual communities, the moral and spiritual qualities of the highest in society. So there's immediate revolutionary impact, which of course has been taken up in contemporary times by Dalit people, downtrodden people, people from the lowest caste converting to Buddhism, following the Buddha's path, because the Buddha is so anti-caste and is about the quintessentially human. The quintessentially human. The human as a potential Buddha. The human as someone who can grow and develop, regardless of their circumstances. So that is radical. But it's radical not because the Buddha is being self-consciously radical or revolutionary. There's no radical chic going on, if you like, to use that expression. It's because he's dealing with the way things are and dealing with the way human beings are. So this is very important because, and it relates, I think, to this topic of individuality, because I think people can often, they can get into a very self-conscious way of speaking. I'm a radical. I'm a revolutionary. You even hear it with some Buddhists friends of mine talk about, I'm a radical Buddhist. As if, and you think, whoa, hold on. Why do you have to say that? Just being a Buddhist is radical. Living a Buddhist life is radical. Why do you have to point yourself in that self-conscious way as a radical? You see it in other spheres of life where people style themselves in a particular way. It seems to be more like a role rather than a response to the way things are, to the reality of what is. So I wanted to make that point, that if you want to really become a shocking Buddhist, just do Buddhism really well. Just get hold of the essence of the Dhamma, the essence of the Buddha's teaching, and just follow it right through in everything you do. Right through in everything you do. That will be shocking. That will be radical. That will be revolutionary. The implications of the Buddha's teaching are really like that. And it's similar, I think, with our own teacher, our founder, Sangharakshita. A lot of his, he's quite an unusual man in some ways, because in some ways he insists he is a traditional Buddhist. He has a very strong sense of tradition. But some of his, if you like, presentations of the Dharma, even some of his challenges to Buddhist tradition, would be regarded as radical and revolutionary. I won't go into all that, but he would say, again, there was no self-conscious attempt to be radical. It was simply responding to the needs of people as they came to him. When he started teaching the Dharma, particularly in the West, it was trying to teach the Buddha's teachings in a new context. And one of the ways he did that in the 1960s and 1970s was by using the language of the individual. The individual. If you look back if you go on Free Buddhist Audio and look up some of Sangharakshita's lectures, you get lectures like the individual, the group, and the spiritual community. That's the most famous one, I think, or the true individual. He was really sort of very, very interested in this idea of the individual. And you can see, in a way, where some of the sort of forces that were going on, 1960s, the movement started in 68. And what's sort of going on in 68? You had all sorts of radical movements going on, revolutionary movements even in Europe. There was this whole questioning of convention. So the language of the individual, the group, and the spiritual community would be, not a word he would use, would be very sexy. It would be very attractive, very exciting. He was always at pains to point out that the individual is not the same as the individualist, which I think is probably what the individual is a myth title is getting at. The individualist could be described as a group of one. It's the person who is completely dependent on different unthinking groups, but they're dependent upon them in reaction rather than in terms of conformity. There's a lot of individualists around who think that they're individuals. That's quite an interesting one. But he was using the word individual as the person who starts to rise above groupthink, rise above the conditioning of the different groups that we're a part of. And over the years, he started to sort of realise that there's all sorts of qualities in an individual. It's not just incredible self-awareness, incredible mindfulness, but also love and compassion, positive emotion generally, imagination, being able to cooperate. And he would see, probably, I would imagine, that the Buddha is the example of the true individual, somebody who is really not of the mass, who, as it were, stands above, but in very, very positive relationship with the world around them. So he really tried to use this language of the individual and individual freedom and liberation very, very positively. On the other hand, I can remember, being around in the early days, I used to get really, I was going to say a rude word then, I used to get really fed up. Because they were friends of mine, including young order members, who really took this language of the individual in a way that I found really sort of offensive. It seemed to be a rationalisation of their own conceit, a rationalisation of their own selfishness. So that if they're off doing something, I don't know, being quite unethical, and you challenge them in some way, and they'd come back with, "I'm an individual. I'm not a group member." And the unsaid thing, "like you." You find that so irritating. I want to punch them. I'm a Buddhist. In any case, they're bigger than me. It's so annoying. Which, of course, doesn't say much for my own individuality, the fact that I got annoyed. But and it was like the ultimate kind of insult that you could get from somebody if you're accused of being a group member. You're not an individual, you're a group member, and when it was said, "Oh God, I'm a group member," I'm not thinking for myself, and go into a sort of panic about, well, what's thinking for myself? Where did these thoughts come from? Who gave them to me? And all this sort of thing. Have a sort of meltdown, and I think generally nobody wants to be accused or to realise that they're in a group doing it. That really is, nobody wants to feel that they're in some sort of group of people, that they're not thinking for themselves, they're not doing it from themselves. I was talking to a Buddhist friend recently who took some non-Buddhist friends to a Buddhist ceremony, a function, and she could tell that they really didn't like it and that she got involved in some sort of cult or something, and she started to feel really uncomfortable. Actually, it turned out they were fine with it, but they just didn't, get on with it. But it was that sort of feeling, oh, I'm brainwashed, I'm in a cult, and all this sort of thing. But I think over the years I've become a lot more understanding, certainly of my own relationship to this whole business of group and individual and spiritual community. And it's very interesting that when people talk about the group, it's always their involvement in the sort of Buddhist community or the Buddhist group that gets criticised. Nobody looks at their involvement with other groups, other group conditioning. It's a bit like, one of the things that we tend to do is that we really go for what's wrong with our Buddhist practice or our Buddhist community. There's another one that you might have come across. You mustn't be willful in your Buddhist life, in your meditation. You mustn't be willful. You mustn't be willful in meditation. It's really bad if you're willful in meditation. And I realised a few years ago, I thought, it's really weird, isn't it? People are paranoid about getting willful in meditation. What about when they are willfully stuffing themselves with chocolates, willfully binging on DVDs, willfully, shopping until they're dropping? Apparently that's not being willful. That's fine. That's all right. Just poor old meditation and making an effort. That's where all the willfulness is, and you've got to be careful. Same with group. It's always, oh, you've got to be so careful. You're in that tree rat a lot at the Sheffield Buddhist Centre. You've got to be careful you're not in a group, But we're in all sorts of groups. We're in all sorts of groups. And if we're going to look at being in a group and being an individual, we've got to look at our allegiances and conditioning across the board. So I have a bit of insight into this. Advertising is very interesting. Advertising is fascinating. It tells you a lot about society and attitudes, I think. And there's a great advert for Levi's. And there's that really dishy guy with the top off, just a pair of Levi's. Do you remember it? He's going through all these big back gardens, probably somewhere in Los Angeles, where there are all these swimming pools and all these gorgeous kind of women. And he just, is diving in each pool and going, and you're thinking, the individual, Levi's, individuality, rugged, good looking. And then you look around, well, everybody was wearing Levi's, or if not Levi's, everybody was wearing jeans, kind of uniform. Is it really the individual? You're thinking, individual, I've got my jeans on. He's a Gap, actually. Because they fit. So and I think that, again, this is where we need to look, the sort of gadgets we have, the must-haves, that we've got to have. Really interesting, sitting in a group of very, very senior order members in the Tri Ratna community up at Adhisthana, public preceptors, people that publicly ordain people. All of them, apart from me, and a few others, they've all got their Apple Macs and iPods, they're all, and their iPhones, and they're doing this, that, and the other. I've got a notebook and a pen. And I'm thinking, why have they all got to have the same thing? You know what I mean? There's something going on there, and I know this might sound a bit funny, but I'm just trying to get us to look at the whole business of group identity across the board. We have all sorts of group identities, and we usually discover those group identities when we feel them starting to be challenged. It's like the thing sometimes, you're in a conversation with somebody and they sort of assume that all Buddhists are socialists. And, you might put forward another political, or somebody puts forward another political idea or an idea that's not particularly socialist. And suddenly everybody's freaking out. Everybody's freaking out. There's a sort of massive assumption. Well, and it's not just a clear discussion. There's an emotional tone that comes in. You think, whoa, there's some group allegiances here. There's some stuff going on here that hasn't really been analysed, or sometimes you can even feel it surprisingly. Sometimes when your nationality is questioned or something like that, you can feel things coming up. Family stuff. What I'm trying to get at is that I think where the group allegiances, where the non-individuality is where we feel a reaction of something that has not been analysed. We all like to think that we think for ourselves, but I wouldn't mind betting that everybody here has a lot of unanalysed material that they haven't really engaged with, that they've just taken on from the world around them. It's unthought through. It's more to do with their attachment to particular views, their aversion to other views, rather than really clear, deeply held individual principle. In one lecture, Sangharakshita once said he thought it would be a very interesting exercise if we sat down and wrote down what we knew ourselves, independent of what we've heard from others, what we've read, what comes through newspapers, radio, TV, the internet, everything else. What we know from ourselves. I find that such a terrifying thought, I've never done it. What we know for ourselves. So I think we need to be really careful when we talk about group identity, group membership, and being an individual. Be really, really careful that we don't assume a position we don't actually have. Actually, to be a true individual is a really demanding thing. I think a lot of our so-called individuality is a myth. It's not really attained. The test, I think, is going to come, when we're seriously threatened. When we're seriously threatened. I have this discussion sometimes when we study the 10 precepts at Padmavajra, our order precepts. And the first precept, like the first of the 5 precepts, is abstaining from killing living beings. And Sangharakshita says it's better, the literal meaning is killing. And people say, well, no, I think it should be harm, because I'm not going to kill anybody, and so it should be harm. And I said, well, how do you know? How do you know? Have you really attained a quality of love that would withstand instinctual responses to threat, not just of you, but say of your loved ones? Your child, your lover, your wife, your husband. Do you know that you could do that? I'm not so confident. I'm not so sure that would be the case. Because, if you are going to have that response of violence, even under threat, that does bring up the question of individuality in the Buddhist sense. What you've really attained in terms of moral and spiritual quality. That's a very dramatic and drastic way of talking, but I think it comes up in other contexts. Like, for example, you're sitting in a group of people in a meeting, and you suddenly realise that you have a different view from everybody else. Maybe it's a view about a person not present. And you don't like the way that the people are criticising that person not present. You feel that there's something going on that isn't right. It's very scary to just speak up. To be the only one sticking up for that person. You're going to become very unpopular, very inconvenient. I've been in situations like this where I have, to my shame, and I'm talking among Buddhists, to my shame, I have held back from speaking up for a principle which I knew to be true. It's extremely humiliating. And, people would do anything sometimes to conform to a group and to another community of people, even with things that apparently are very, very good. But sometimes we're in that position. That's a great test of our individuality and our connection with the Dharma. It's a great test of our ethics. I really admire people. I really bow down to people who are a lone voice, for principle, for ethics, for morality, for love in an environment of violence and threat and so on. I think that's an extraordinary thing, to be alone in that situation where everything is becoming very inconvenient for you. I mentioned the conversion to Buddhism by Dalits in the 1950s, and I know you had some Indian order members here, good friends of mine, actually, who were teaching here the other week. And I met people who were among the first conversions with Dr. Ambedkar, their great leader, in the late 50s. And I asked them what their experience was. This was a village somewhere in Maharashtra. I've lived in India for quite a long time. And they said the feeling was one of incredible freedom. Just to go for refuge to the Buddha, just to completely renounce and reject the oppression of Hinduism, to step out from caste oppression in this way was an amazing moment of freedom and spiritual rebirth. But they said there was no, in many ways it made their life more difficult because they were boycotted by the local shopkeepers. They were abused by caste Hindus even more, more oppression. But their actual experience was liberation. Well, that's individuality. Acting from, that great conviction, that great faith you have in the quintessentially human, as expressed in Buddhist practice, even though your life becomes more difficult. That's the kind of individuality that we want, that we need to aspire to. So, rather than all these sort of, these individualistic things that we can so often get caught up with, I realise I'm not saying very much about the individual as a myth, but no matter. Perhaps you can knock all that out. What I want to do, to the last part of my talk, I want to talk about how we might attain greater individuality in this positive sense, not individualism, but greater individuality. And I'm going to do this through a teaching that some of you might not have heard before. It's called the 3 vivekas. The 3 vivekas. Now, the word viveka is a word not easy to translate. It doesn't, in a way, sound that appealing in some ways. It can be translated as seclusion, detachment, even sort of isolation, even sort of singularity in some ways. In Hinduism, it has the meaning of discrimination, and actually in Buddhism too, to some extent. But there's this idea that you're moving away from, moving apart from something in order to open up to something greater. So these 3 vivekas are kaya viveka, the seclusion of the body; chitta viveka, the seclusion of the heart or the mind; and upadi viveka, which is more best to translate as being apart from or secluded from. Literally, upadi means something like substrate, but it means here conditioned existence itself. So let's run through these, see what the tradition has to say about them, see how they might apply to our experience to do with attaining a true individuality. And in this way, hopefully that will expose that the individual is a myth as well. So kaya viveka, the seclusion of body, traditionally this is explained in terms of the way the Buddha explains it, the tradition explains it. You go away from people. You go to a forest, you go to the jungle, you go to the foot and the roots of a tree, you go to a cave, you go to a mountain, you go into the depths of things to meditate. You take yourself away from the usual hurly-burly distractions around you that is just keeping exciting your conditioning, it's exciting your cravings and attachments and aversions, you move away from the group. And they do a lot of discussion about going away from fools. They use this word. The word is bala, which is Sangha actually more kindly translates as the spiritually immature. You go away from, in other words, people who are not supportive of this kind of life. I know this might sound terribly elitist and all the rest of it, but it is worth investigating in terms of looking at the attainment of individuality. There are people who, they might not be consciously trying to do it, but they can really hold us down. They can really hold us down. In fact, we can be holding them down. It can be co-created, the holding down of one another. That's what the group, the oppressive group, really is. It's a mutual holding each other down. And it's good to get away from it. It's good to get away from it. It's good to go away where you haven't got the usual distractions, where you can be with yourself, and where you can allow yourself to unfold in an entirely different way. What does mean for, for the old Buddhist practitioners? It means literally going off to the forest depths. What could it mean for us? Well, some people do sort of, not exactly the forest, but Padmavajra, just here. He hasn't been away to the forest, but he's been away in a little hut in the north of Scotland by the great and mighty ocean on a 3-week solitary retreat. He's really been practicing Kaya Viveka. So if you want to know what that's like, go and ask him what the effect is. But we do this. You can go on solitary retreats. But also you can go on retreats with other people. And regularly at the centre here, retreats are organised just for a weekend. And okay, you're with other people, but you're away from your usual routines. You're away even from the usual people you're involved with, wonderful though you regard them as being and all the rest of it. You're in an environment where all the people there are there to practice Buddhism, practice meditation. And you experience yourself and life in an entirely different way. You start noticing very, very different things. You start to become more distinct to yourself and other people. In other words, you start to become more of an individual. But we can practice it day in and day out, this Kaya Viveka, in different ways. If you have a daily meditation practice, you're practicing Kaya Viveka, because when you meditate, you switch off the radio, hope you do. You switch off the iPhone, hope you do. You switch off everything. You close your eyes. You're in the place dedicated for meditation practice. The house, hopefully, is reasonably quiet, at least your bit of it. And you can go in. You can go into dealing with what's actually going on in your mind. But we can practice it even more than that, not just the daily meditation practice. I think it would be a very good idea to practice technological fasting. Technological fasting. Some people do this, don't they? Where they have a week of no electronic gadgetry, no input, just to have a break from the overwhelming input that's always going in. I think we are in a very, very difficult time for the emergence of real individuality and real people really experiencing themselves and a wider consciousness, because we're constantly being bombarded with information. Constantly. I know there's all the stuff about being connected and being tuned in and all the rest of it, but it's so important to have a break from that. I really wonder, in fact, sometimes how we're going to really create a true meditative tradition in the West at the moment, because I think most people will be suffering, from attention deficit disorder of one kind or another. Well, I see it, I was in London the other day having a meal with a friend of mine, lovely Japanese restaurant, and I looked across the table at the people opposite me, and they had their iPhones out, and they're talking, and they're looking at this, and they're talking, and eating, and I'm thinking, what's that doing to you? What's that doing to your consciousness? What's that doing? How's that creating any kind of integrated, focused, individual life with all this stuff kind of pouring into you. I also think for mental health reasons, it's very, very important to have periods where you're definitely cut off. I think the whole kind of 24-hour news feed thing is really difficult for people. We're constantly being fed disaster stories about things we can't do anything about. We can't actually do anything about them. I know you've got to be aware of everything going on, but believe me, there's so many things we can't do anything about. If somebody was run over out there, we'd be out there, we could do something. There would be an immediate, compassionate response. We're presented with stories of the world's disasters, that the world is coming to an end and all the rest of it, which we can do very little about, directly to affect it. I think that's really depotentiating. It's a real undermining of individual potency and power, if you like, and strength. Debatable point, I know, but I think one really needs to think about reducing input, really reducing input. So Kaya Viveka is removing yourself from all this, from time to time. So that when you do go back to it, you've really got some strength to deal with it, to be in relationship to it. But yes, pulling away, renouncing, turning away from that. And there's a happiness in that. Viveka is associated with happiness and joy. The joy of being free from all that worry and anxiety. Worry and anxiety is no good. You might have all sorts of feelings about the state of the world. If you're anxious, it's negative. That's a negative mental state. That's not productive. That's not helpful to your individuality. It's not helpful to your growth, anxiety and worry. It's not the same as compassion and love and creative input. So Kaya Viveka, moving away. You move away in order to experience Chitta Viveka, which is seclusion of the heart. And what this means, okay, there you are. Let's say if you're let's imagine ourselves as Amoghavaksha in his hut by the ocean. He's removed himself into this really beautiful environment and he's getting on with his meditation. He hasn't told me any of this, I'm just making it up. I know he's been on a retreat, but what I say now is, so there he is, he's sitting in meditation, and great, off we go, we're going off, we're going up, deeply into meditation, up and down and deep, and then there's all sorts of distractions. The mind is just full of stuff, isn't it? Delicious food that you can't have because the shop's miles away and you bring that particular food stuff, maybe other things I can't even mention. Passing through the mind, all sorts of fears, aversions. I won't speak for a moment about it now, I'll speak for myself. I go on solitary retreat and I spend a lot of time having arguments out loud with people who aren't there. Mental. I mean, can you believe that? Big arguments about things that haven't happened. I told you. There's not much to show for it, but this residual stuff, this residual conditioning. Now the thing is, what's going on when you face your mind? And of course, this can happen when you're at home meditating, or just when you're being silent. You're facing up to your deep conditioning factors. And those things mean that you are part of a group. You aren't an individual. You haven't left, the swirling mass of impulse responses. These are called, generally in meditation, the 5 mental hindrances, or the 5 poisons. And what you have to do through meditation is achieve the solitude of the heart, in the sense that the heart moves away from those things. The sort of language is that they're falling away through practices like the mindfulness of breathing, the metta bhavana, puja, mindfulness practice. What starts to happen? They start to drop away. Gradually, slowly, they drop away. And you start to move more into the centre of the chitta, the heart, or the mind. It becomes vast, expanded, and very, very pleasurable. This is typically called the jhanas or the dhyanas, the absorptions. So the mind is apart from all that stuff. It's having a break from all that mental rubbish that keeps you sort of stuck in very unconstructive relationships to other people in the world. And of course it starts flowing over outside of meditation into other things too. You don't have to go into a retreat to experience this. I'm sure if you've taken up meditation and you're meditating regularly, you've had a taste of this. You've had a taste of things just dropping away, just disengaging from all that usual stuff. You're not so enchanted by it. And there's this sense of the fullness of the heart. The thing is about it, it comes and goes. It's not sort of, at the level of chitta viveka, it's not finally achieved. You know, you have to keep making an effort. You have to keep meditating. You have to keep practicing. You have to keep going into retreat. You have to keep meeting with spiritual friends, people who will encourage that in you. But yes, you start to experience some sort of progression. Also, the other thing, as well as experiencing yourself as having a certain sort of, well, one of the words that they use in Buddhist texts for this is a certain mastery. They don't often use this word, but you've got this teaching of the basis of mastery, as they call it. You're becoming a master of yourself, a mistress of yourself. You're less swayed by the things around you. One of the things that goes with that, of course, is a changed relationship with others. Something much more characterised by metta, by loving kindness and the other positive emotions. And also, as well as experiencing your own mastery, your own sense of positive individuality, is an increasing sense of the individuality of others. So your relationship with others begins to change. Instead of seeing them as, part of a kind of an attachment or an aversion situation that can so often go on in our different relationships in family, in workplace, and everywhere else, even among Buddhists, you're seeing them more as they are in themselves, more distinct, more individual, more with that quality of viveka. You see their quality, and it's as important to you to develop your own individuality and your own sense of mastery. It's as important to you to bring that out in others as to do it with yourself. It's a very, very important thing. So true individuality isn't opposed to community, to an experience of community. And this is what a spiritual community really is. A spiritual community is made up of people becoming more particular, more individual, more uniquely themselves, but in perfect harmony with one another. And sometimes you can really experience that. Particularly when you're doing a collective metta practice, you can really have that sense of everybody's uniqueness being there and a wonderful sense of harmony. I was talking to Gaurava earlier about the Avatamsaka Sutra, or he was telling me about it because it's a great love of his, this huge sutra which talks about the mutual interpenetration of all phenomena. Wonderful vision of enlightenment, that everything in life, all phenomena in life are like different coloured rays of light mutually crisscrossing one another. They don't wipe each other out, they just enhance one another. Well, that's what we're like. That's what the spiritual community is really like. But at the level of chitta viveka, it comes and goes. It comes and goes. We've got to keep fighting for it, if you like. It only becomes definitive with upadi viveka, where with this viveka, this is very mysterious, you leave, you become secluded from, you transcend, that's probably the best word, conditioned existence itself. In other words, you see through your fixed habits that make up this sense of an illusory self and other. You see through all that. That all dissolves and vanishes. It's not that you're not there, it's not that others aren't there, but you see through any fixed and unchanging entities at all. And that's with you all the time. That's with you all the time. It never leaves you. And this is when your individuality, your distinctness is complete. And here we're going well beyond, I think, being able to describe it. This is the domain of the Bodhisattva and of the Buddha. These great beings who are in the world but not of it. Very mysterious statement. They're completely in relationship with others, very, very positively. But they're not defined by it. You get this sense with the Buddha, walking around northern India, communicating with people, not distracted by appearances. Being able to communicate with anybody, only interested in their individual potential. There's wonderful stories where, the Buddha, people who have been neglected by everybody else, the Buddha sees their potential. My favourite is of a leper named Super Buddha, who sees a crowd and thinks, crowd, food, I'll go and beg. And lepers, in India are like untouchables. So he goes over to the crowd. The crowd is a group of people around the Buddha for a teaching. And the Buddha, as he usually did, would survey the audience, taking everybody in, but really noticing those who were sort of outstanding in their potential. The Buddha had those powers of empathy, that kind of quality of consciousness that can just fill the space and really pick out the individual. And he saw that it's the leper, it's Super Buddha who will really see. So he just directed the Dharma to this man who, in that moment, through that teaching, becomes enlightened. Wow. This is the quality of the Buddha, being in this world but not of it, and seeing people in an entirely different way from the way we see them. So this is Upadhi Viveka, being secluded from conditioned existence, but really being in the world but not of it. We can perhaps get a little taste of this on a much lower level. Over the years, I've made a study of Sufism, different Sufi traditions, and there's a Sufi tradition called the Naqshbandis, very important Sufi order all over the Sufi world, and they have I think 9 main practices, and one of them is called seclusion amidst the crowd. Solitude amidst the crowd. Very interesting idea that you are with people, you are in the world, you are operating in the world, but you're not defined by it. You're not defined by those people. You're even in very, very positive, empathic relationship with them, but you're not defined by it. What you're drawing on, in the Sufi tradition, of course, you're drawing on Allah, but in Buddhist tradition, it's not the same thing. You're drawing on the Lokuttara, the transcendental. You're drawing on Bodhi, on enlightenment, on bodhicitta, on the enlightened mind. So you're with people, but you are strangely in relationship to something else. Very mysterious. Very, very mysterious. And I think it explains why sometimes when you read the life of the Buddha, you always have this feeling of somebody wonderfully compassionate and present, and yet even the great disciples can sort of touch him. They can't sort of, he's a mystery to them. He's sort of beyond them. On our own level, on a much lower level, in a sense, we have to practice this, because we can be with people very often in our workplace, even in our family, where we are really deeply into the Dharma and practicing, but everything going on around us is the sort of opposite of that. I know this can be very, very painful for some people, that they can feel a real conflict because they feel very close to their near and dear ones and their colleagues, and yet their values are very, very different. And that's a real practice, I think, of viveka, of individuality, of having to be there, upholding your own values, and yet being in relationship with people who don't share them. Very, very poignant for people. And that's why it's also important that you have a regular connection with your spiritual friends within the Buddhist community. Sometimes, friends have told me, I've done this for a long time myself, that, some of their old friends, they've gone out with them and, they're really drinking and so on, and they just can't do that. They don't want to drink. It's not that they're killjoys, it's not they're being moralistic, they just don't want to lose the quality of awareness that they have. They don't want to get involved with those old discussions and some of the sort of attitudes that go with it. Nonetheless, they want to stay in relationship to them. So I think that's a real challenge of individuality that Buddhists, particularly nowadays, have to practice. And perhaps it's a very distant reflection of this solitude amidst the crowd and this transcendental individuality of the Buddha. So that's it, really. I hope that's been helpful in terms of looking at this area. I hope you've been shocked. I hope I'm trying to shock you, but I've just been communicating the Dharma as I understand it. So remember, Kaya Viveka, the seclusion of the body, Chitta Viveka, the seclusion of the heart, Upadhi Viveka, transcending conditioned existence itself, being in the world.